Good morning and Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim friends and colleagues. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining SCG's 2021 Public Policy Conference, Build Anew. And thank you for joining us on this overcast and even cool morning, at least where I am here on Tongva land. And so you've reached the Advocacy Beyond the Ballot Box session. I'm really looking forward to a rich discussion with some key philanthropic advocacy leaders of what's happening now and what's coming next to ensure that systems change work is sustained and invested in to achieve a more equitable and just society. My name is Nona Randwa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a middle-aged white woman with long brown, graying in a pretty cool way hair and bangs that are not really cooperating today. And I am the California director and an attorney with the Alliance for Justice and our Boulder Advocacy program. Before we really get launched into our session today, I want to give you an overview of the structure of the session. So first, for attendees who are newer to the advocacy landscape, I'm going to give a brief, about 10-minute overview of the legal framework that allows foundations to advocate and support nonprofits that advocate and lobby. Then, most of our session will be focused on learning about advocacy and action through case studies from two foundations, one public and one private, each engaging in advocacy in different ways. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat, and we will get to as many as possible during the Q&A portion of our session, which will be towards the end. So at this point, let's go ahead and start my slide presentation and get into it. Wonderful, thank you. So as a very brief introduction, Boulder Advocacy is a program of Alliance for Justice that supports foundations and their grantees to empower them to engage in and maximize their advocacy. The leading national experts on the legal framework for nonprofit advocacy, Boulder Advocacy provides legal and capacity building training and resources to support nonprofit advocacy. We have a team of attorneys and other nonprofit advocacy experts who staff a free questions about nonprofit advocacy. We have two offices in California, and I'm based in Los Angeles, having represented nonprofit organizations here as an attorney for about 25 years. So I thought that it might be a good idea to get on the same page. Oh, there we go. On the same page that I'm trying to be on about kind of what I mean by advocacy, what we mean by advocacy at Boulder Advocacy, and hearing any additional perspectives on that from our panelists. So I think about advocacy, about championing or supporting a cause or a goal for policy or systems change. And I'm sure there are many other definitions out there. One of the reasons I bring this up is that advocacy doesn't have a specific legal definition. It's a very broad concept about working to make change that impacts many people. So lobbying is one form of advocacy that's regulated by the IRS for tax-exempt foundations, and it has a very specific definition, but advocacy is a much larger concept. So this next slide has many different colored tiles that have examples of different kinds of advocacy work. So as you can see, there are many different activities that contribute to the outcome of changing rules, systems, and policies. So the activities that are listed in green that have to do with building relationships with government officials, research, litigation, working to influence executive action or administrative agency rules and regulations are not restricted in any way by a funder's tax status. So these are activities that funders can engage in all day, every day. And you may notice that lobbying and voter registration are in yellow. So this is to indicate that you should know the rules before you move forward with funding or engaging in these activities so that you can stay in compliance. Of course, partisan political activity is in red because, as you likely know, all 501c3 organizations, including private foundations and community foundations, are prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for office. The main thing I want you to take from this slide is that there are many activities that your organization can engage in the advocacy space. I think it's worth discussing why advocacy is important for funders. Certainly this question is of the utmost importance now as we recognize that white supremacy and COVID-19 have created and highlighted deep inequities in our state and our country and our world. And we think about how much work needs to be done to build anew from these plagues that are happening. So I look forward to hearing other people's perspectives from Jenny and Zahira about the importance of advocacy. But one thing that when I talk to funders who are interested in advocacy, it's usually because they're aware of its power to leverage resources. And so I have an example of a study that the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy did, finding that there was a benefit of $115 in community benefits for every $1 spent by a foundation on advocacy. And so we know that it's impactful and it helps to drive larger change. Another thing to keep in mind about advocacy is that policy or systems change really only happens through collaboration, in coalitions, and in partnerships. And there are a variety of different roles that need to be filled to achieve success. So not all of these roles will be a right fit for every funder based on your tax status, your size, your orientation, your mission. But there is a fit for any funder who wants to be involved in supporting or engaging in advocacy. So one question that many funders have when they're funding advocacy is, how do I know what advocacy will be effective or whether the grantee I'm thinking of funding has the ability to make a difference? One contribution that Alliance for Justice has made to that question are our capacity assessment tools for advocacy and community organizing. So these tools are available on our website. They break down advocacy and community organizing into their component parts to help advocacy and organizing groups assess their strengths and where they want to grow stronger or partner differently to increase their readiness to act. Funders find kinds of advocacy investments to make, and they're available on the boulderadvocacy.org website. So now to the question that keeps me employed every day. Is it actually legal for funders to engage in or support advocacy? And so short answer, depending on your tax status, whether you're a private foundation, public or community foundation, LLC, government agency, individual donor, there are different ways you can be involved. But the short answer is that all funders can be engaged in some kinds of advocacy, and all funders can fund nonprofits that advocate and lobby. And Boulder Advocacy is a resource to the funder community to help you answer any questions you may have about that. My apologies for that truck that's driving by. So I don't have time today to go through all the rules, and I'm not going to, but I just want to kind of highlight for you that there's kind of a framework that I will show you here briefly with public charities or community foundations on the left, which are some of those are grant making entities, some of these are your grantees that have the same kind of public charity status with the IRS, and then private foundations are on the right. So as you know, partisan political activity, as I mentioned, supporting or opposing candidates for office, that is prohibited for all 501c3 organizations. And these are two different kinds of 501c3s. So whether that's presidential or school board, local, we can't support or oppose candidates for office. So in kind of the middle category of kind of you need to know the rules before you move forward, we have lobbying, which is allowed for public charities and public foundations within a limit that's defined by their tax status, and is prohibited for private foundations in terms of earmarking funds for lobbying. So I'm not going to go through the definition of lobbying, but in short, I'm talking about influencing legislation or ballot measures when I talk about lobbying. So lobbying constitutes a taxable expense for private foundations and their managers who knowingly agree to a lobbying expense. Voter registration drives are not limited for community foundations and public charities as long as they're conducted in a nonpartisan way. But private foundations do have additional restrictions that can be hard to navigate. So at the bottom, we have a green light, and that reflects many different activities that you might think of as lobbying, but they actually fall outside the IRS definition, and therefore they're perfectly safe for any kind of funder to do or fund as much as they want, like influencing executive orders or agency regulations, communicating with the public, expressing a view to support or oppose legislation without making a call to action, which is a specific legal term. So, for instance, a foundation can tell the general public that they support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but if they don't ask people to contact their legislators or give people contact information or means to contact their legislators or mention any specific legislators, that's not lobbying. And it's something that anyone can do. Or a foundation that communicates with the governor or the Department of Public Health to weigh in on executive actions around COVID-19 vaccination, for example, is not lobbying under IRS rules because it's working to impact administrative action, not legislative action. So, you know, even in the election space, which we're not talking as much about today, there is still a lot that private foundations can do, even if they are not able to meet those specific rules for voter registration drives, really educating voters about the voting process, the importance of voting, what's on the ballot. We saw so much good work in this space by Philanthropy in 2020. Of course, if we face a recall election this fall, it will be important to ensure that voters can safely and easily know what is on the ballot and exercise their voting rights. So one real important thing to keep in mind is that the prohibition, nope, is my slide working here? The prohibition on private foundations is that they cannot lobby themselves or earmark funds for lobbying. Move forward. But they can fund organizations that lobby, either through general support grants or specific project grants that are not earmarked for lobbying. So that is about all I have time for in terms of the overview of the rules. And I'm going to kind of change gears here. But at that time, as I do that, I want to say that if you have questions about kind of, oh, you know, I am going to change gears, but first I'm contractually required to encourage you to not restrict your grantees from lobbying. That putting those restrictions in your grant agreements that say that grantees cannot lobby is really not necessary unless you're funding C4s, which is something we're going to talk about. It really limits their flexibility, and we've seen how important it is for our partners on the ground to have the flexibility they need to act within their power and ability to strengthen our society. So please, if I could make one impassioned request, it would be to consider taking out any clauses from your grant agreements that restrict and prohibit grantees, 501c3 grantees from lobbying with your funds. You know, it's great to say that it's not, a grant is not earmarked for lobbying, but that's not the same thing as saying that it cannot be used for lobbying. All right. So you have access to many of our materials in the program materials, and I wanted to just offer that I will be available both through direct message in the conference app or through my email at nona@afj.org to answer any specific questions that you may have. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to our panelists because they are really the ones that we want to hear from in terms of what kinds of advocacy work they've been doing and they are doing. So just a reminder that we're going to hear from Jenny Dellwood, the Executive Vice President at the Liberty Hill Foundation. Then we're going to hear from Zahira Mann, Senior Program Officer at the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation. But we'll be starting with Jenny shortly. And just a reminder to Zahira and Jenny to please introduce yourselves and provide a brief physical description for accessibility purposes. So here's my first question for Jenny. Once we get her up on the screen and you can take down my slides, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking Jenny a question and giving her about 7 minutes or so to respond. So as a public foundation, Liberty Hill was extremely active in this past election, supporting 2 ballot measures, the Schools and Communities First Prop 15 ballot measure and the local Measure J initiative. So what was the organization's process in deciding to get involved, and what were the specific ways that Liberty Hill engaged in these measures? And most importantly, now that we're after, we've come through the 2020 election cycle, how is this work going to continue?
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. My name is Jenny Dellwood, Executive Vice President at the Liberty Hill Foundation. I'm wearing a blue sweater blazer and a pink sweater with some blue stripes, navy stripes, and I'm a Filipina woman with glasses and dark brown hair. And in response to the question, Nona, it's always fun to be on a panel with you. Yes, Liberty Hill was extremely excited this past election cycle to full-throatedly endorse Schools and Communities First and Measure J. This was actually the first time that we were making such significant endorsements directly in such a significant way. For us at Liberty Hill, it was really just critical and necessary and a great evolution of our grant making. We believe first and foremost in leading with our values, and these 2 ballot initiatives definitely were all about equity and justice. And so we knew we had to figure out a way to engage. We obviously consulted our board, engaged obviously staff, and most importantly, community leaders, grassroots organizers, and those directly impacted by the issues. And these 2 ballot initiatives really were led by community organizers on the ground in communities of color, low-income communities of color in particular. And those that were leading the charge on both ballot initiatives were those that were directly impacted by systemic oppression. So for us, that was motivation enough to definitely endorse. And for us, there was a lot of enthusiasm as well from donors throughout our community at the Liberty Hill Foundation, as well as community partners. So we thought, you know what, let's go all in and not only lend our resources, money, and solid, dollars to support the ballot initiative, but also engage in some of the strategy around the campaign. We led lent out staff actually to be on the ground and support Schools and Communities First to help fundraise for the campaign and take basically a year on a special project assignment. And we also provided support in relation to some mailers and other communications supports as well. Meanwhile, we also launched our Liberty Vote program, relaunched our Liberty Vote program, funding directly 501c3 and C4 organizations to engage in direct voter engagement and integrated voter engagement, both for, during, and after the election. So for us, the decision was really made easy by three simple factors. One being our values, equity and justice. Two, being led by community organizations and community organizers, those directly impacted. And third, the significant need. Unfortunately, there is not a whole lot of resources, as we all know in philanthropy. We know each other that there aren't a lot of resources flowing from foundations to ballot initiatives. And there's good reason. Some of it is related to legal parameters. And some of it, frankly, is related to risk aversion. And so at Liberty Hill, we said we no longer want to be risk averse. This is what our community is screaming for, and a huge need. Major campaigns, our groups on the ground are taking major risks, and we need to as well. So that sums up the reasons why. And the next question was around now what, right? One ballot initiative, of course, Measure J1. The other ballot initiative, Schools and Communities First, unfortunately did not succeed. And so we as Liberty Hill are not going away in terms of support for these efforts. In fact, with Measure J, we've actually initiated a pooled fund to fund the implementation of the measure. We like to talk about this term and phrase of participatory implementation. It's really necessary for advocates and organizers and those with lived experience to continue the fight, not only to win the ballot initiative, but also now to implement this really exciting and groundbreaking ballot initiative, ensuring that the implementation of the ballot initiative is done in a way that truly meets the need of community and reflects the intent of the ballot initiative itself. So right now there's tremendous amount of advocacy as well as commission work within the Measure J Advisory Committee to ensure that the dollar amount that's allocated is robust, and to ensure that what's funded through Measure J is truly reimagining what we think about in terms of safety and justice in Los Angeles County. On Schools and Communities First, that one's a little bit different because obviously there's not a set of policies to implement. However, the work continues. The coalition that led the campaign, the Million Voter Project, California Calls, and other configurations of advocates and activists throughout the state continue to plan what's next, when might we go to the ballot again. And so we're continuing to fund both 501c3 organizations and 501c4 organizations to think about the next strategy and what that looks like, whether it be a ballot initiative, approaches to get at that revenue that's really needed to support our schools and communities. And also, we're continuing to dedicate our staff time and funding to public partnerships. Some of the goals of Schools and Communities First were to ensure robust, housing availability. And so at Liberty Hill, we've started a new public-private partnership with the County of Los Angeles, the City of Los Angeles, and about 20 community-based organizations and legal service providers to ensure that tenants are able to stay in their housing currently and to prevent homelessness. So those are a couple of things that get at the goals of the ballot initiative that may not look exactly the same as the ballot initiative around Prop 13, but are moving in that direction. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Nona.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have so many follow-up questions, and maybe our audience does as well. So please post those in the chat. We will get to that. And at this point, though, I will transition over and ask Zahira a question. And so part of the advocacy that is so catalytic and really impactful is government relations. And the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, which is a private foundation, has been incredibly successful in partnering with the government. So could you just describe for us the work and share some different and unique ways that Parsons engages with government locally and statewide in terms of relationship building and public-private partnerships?
Absolutely. Thank you. And good morning, almost good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be with everyone. My name is Zahira Mann. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black woman with braided hair, wearing a black shirt and jacket and a pearl necklace. I'm a senior program officer at the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation. At the foundation, we focus on improving the well-being of Angelenos through responsive grant making in the areas of health, human services, education, and civic and culture. Responsive grant making is about 80% of our work, but roughly 20% of our time is spent on special projects and initiatives that are focused on organizational effectiveness, collaboration, and systems change. We understand that meaningful change requires work and partnership with others. And over the past decade, we have launched, supported, or taken leadership roles in a wide range of public-private partnerships. How all of this connects to working with governmental partners is embedded in our roles as convener, grant maker, and constituent. So in the role of convener, a key component are the public-private partnerships that I mentioned. And the success of those rests in authentic relationship building. While this focus on relationship building can seem amorphous or a luxury at times, this part of the work is essential because you must develop relationships that are authentic and trusting for deep partnership, and you need to develop them before you actually need them. Otherwise, the interactions can become more transactional rather than mutually beneficial. While there are a number of the foundation's efforts that illustrate this work, I'm going to focus on our child welfare work because that's the work that I manage for the foundation. And I'm going to narrow in on our work around Foster Together Network. Foster Together Network, or FTN, is a collective impact effort we launched about 4 years ago with First by Ballot, the Center for Strategic Partnerships, which is housed within the county CEO's office, the LA County Department of Children and Families, and nearly two dozen other partners from government, philanthropy, and community-based organizations. The work launched to address an issue that resulted from a then recently enacted state law that required youth in foster care to be in homes with families rather than in group care settings. Just as this need for homes was increasing, the actual availability of homes was at best remaining stagnant. The issue was something that DCFS was working on from an operational perspective, and Philanthropy was hearing about in conversations with grantees and reading about in the imprint, LA Times, and other materials. As part of our initial launch, we connected a landscape analysis through incredible consultants who helped ground us in a shared objective understanding of the problem and some of the solutions. With that in hand, we created additional spaces in the form of subcommittees that were co-chaired by the public and private sector, where we could grow our collective thinking and strategic efforts. These subcommittees were defined by the needs and opportunities that were seen within the community, focusing on engaging actionable data and research, developing strong cross-sector partnerships, and maintaining balanced and thoughtful governance of our actual group. We have since added another effort that's focused on equity to address disparities within the child welfare system. What has been key to this collective effort is having the voices of all these players around the table. And it now includes even more county departments with probation and the Department of Mental Health, additional community-based organizations, including the foster family agencies that are also responsible for placing children in out-of-home care, youth, and caregivers. And we're all there to think through problems, develop solutions, pilot projects, and then have that lasting work embedded within the public system. And since we're doing this together and this level of co-creation, what ends up becoming embedded within the system is really lasting. So for example, the data subcommittee worked on a dashboard that started as a list of items to measure and understand, and it evolved into shared work product with the staff at the Department of Children and Family Services to create a tool that didn't previously exist and is now embedded within DCFS. The work of the cross-sector work group resulted in a virtual conference put on by the public and private sector, hosting 500 people, and has led to the further incorporation of youth, caregiver, and hopefully soon birth parent voice in these efforts, as well as the development of ongoing training series and the highlighting of additional needs that we could collectively address to improve child welfare. And then the interfaith effort is now incorporated within DCFS, and that alone involves well over 100 stakeholders throughout the county. All of these people thinking together has been beneficial, but what has been the real benefit is what occurs when you're in an authentic relationship. Everyone starts to be honest and name the real problems and create true solutions. With that, there is a flipping of sort that happens within the advocacy process. Rather than going to the public entities with solutions that you want them to implement, they come to you with problems and ideas, and you help to shape solutions together. There is within this a high degree of shared vulnerability and trust in order to actually reach to the point of these solutions. And just as a very recent example, one of the ways that this has been really critical is that when COVID first shook our county, there were relationships in place to help facilitate implementation of efforts that resulted in needed and hard to obtain PPE and technology, which created a real impact in the lives of Angelenos. The second way is our role as grant maker. While the relationship building really draws on the convening power of foundations, the grant making piece is another area that plays a role within these public-private partnerships, because there are ways in which where the public funder is investing in something where that's going to be a lasting and sustained investment. And sometimes there's a little bit of private resources that are needed where we can then partner with our public partners in order to see that investment. Oftentimes, public dollars are large, but they're generally hard to move quickly. And private dollars are typically more limited in comparison, but can be moved relatively quickly and flexibly. And so in terms of this continuum and this augmentation that can happen with our dollars, there's a way to do that to ensure that the projects move forward and that we're thinking and co-creating together, and they're implemented in a way that then achieves some of the concerns that philanthropy is looking at, as well as the public sector. And the last piece I'll just mention briefly is our role as constituent. So in terms of our role, there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is just the place that foundations sit in. We're really at the balcony and we're looking over lots of different types of work. We're working with a number of different nonprofits. And so we're seeing issues play out in so many different settings. And there come from that understanding these thematic, systemic pieces that we can then share with our public sector partners who are able to see things from a very different vantage point and a very different perspective. For example, we sit on the California Child Welfare Co-Investment Partnership with other foundations, as well as with some statewide governmental entities. And the other role of constituent is more of the classic role as constituent. We exist within districts. We have specific legislators who are assigned to us and who we can be in conversation with. And that is where the support, which is a very significant support from Southern California grant makers and Philanthropy California comes in, where they will do days where there are visits to our representatives, where they compile the materials for us and we can have conversations the issues that we're seeing, including those issues that affect the nonprofit sector. So those are some of the ways in which we kind of show up in this space, but a lot of it focuses on the relationship building and the overall building of trust that happens between the various sectors.
Thank you. So that's fascinating, and thank you for sharing with us. And I was going to say this at the beginning, but I've been so looking forward to this session because I'm really honestly just interested to hear all the things that both Jenny and Zahira are sharing with us today. So please be putting questions in chat. We're moving into some questions from the audience soon, so we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. And I think one question that I will ask to both of you, and we can start with Zahira and then Jenny can come in next, is how can philanthropy play a role in holding the government accountable after elections or ballot measures or other laws are passed? How do you see that role for philanthropy? Zahira.
Thank you for that question. And, I think really there are a couple of different ways. I think the first way is that as part of philanthropy engaging with government, providing enough space so that the community is at the table and the community can hold government accountable. because they're in deep relationship with them. So for example, with some of the efforts that we've done, the community groups and community members are also sitting shoulder to shoulder with the various governmental entities and are in relationship. And so they are able to hold them accountable because they also know what's happening on the ground. There are so many times when there is a beautiful sounding policy that is implemented, and when we actually look to see what occurs, it just doesn't play out the way that it was written. And we only know that because of the community groups and because of the community members who are living it every day. We don't know how something that's written in black and white actually plays out unless we have close connection with those individuals. The other piece I would say in terms of philanthropy is because we're in communication with so many different nonprofits, and if you're also in the process of building relationships with governmental entities, electeds, their staff are actually really critical, then some of that information, as you're having regular contact and regular communication with them, you can just share with them what you're seeing across the sector. You're not making a request, you're reflecting back. And the more you're in relationship, the more organic and authentic it's going to feel to be able to reflect back. And in terms of being able to maintain those connections, a lot of times that's a role that foundations can fill, that community organizations or one individual isn't going to be able to fill, because of, again, that vantage point of being able to see lots of different nonprofits and be able to have a broader sense of what's happening within a community. Thank you.
I agree
Thanks,
with
Jenny, what are your
everything
thoughts?
definitely agree with everything that Zahira said, and in complete alignment. I'll bring a little bit of additional detail to the conversation. I think in regards to being able to ensure that community has the time, the capacity, as well as the resources to be at the table and to hold government accountable, I think it's critical to fund community organizing and critical to fund advocacy in particular. I think that there are many times that the government may have the greatest of intentions, but the reality is that their vantage point is limited because they can't see everything that's happening in the county, or they may be a different class or geography or just have a different lived experience and perspective that individuals throughout the community and on the ground most directly impacted by the issues. So I think that being able to fund organizations in a robust manner to be able to do the community organizing and advocate directly themselves is the best accountable. Additionally, at Liberty Hill, we've had a commissions training program. And this program is about training advocates, activists, those with lived experience to sit on boards and commissions locally here in Los Angeles. And this training program also helps people to get appointed to these seats, which are in large part oversight entities and advisory entities, some policy making, but really it's a formal way for the government to hear directly from constituents on a regular basis about a particular set of topics. So for us, we've been able to help get folks appointed. We mentioned Measure J, to the Measure J Advisory Committee, to the Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council, to a number of entities, the Rent Stabilization or the Rental Oversight Commission in LA County, a number of entities that actually oversee critical policies, oftentimes policies that community organizers and advocates that we fund have fought along many years for. And now that the policy is being implemented, their voices are just as critical to ensure that the policies are implemented in a constructive and community reflective way, centering those at the heart of the issues always. So those are a couple of thoughts around holding government accountable. Certainly think that there are many other ways and tools, from testifying at Board of Supervisors or city council meetings or the state legislature. Oftentimes, if invited as a expert panelist, it is not considered lobbying to provide that voice sign-on letters and being, not being afraid to just pick up the phone and call directly, a legislator, an elected official, a deputy, to ensure that they know the perspective of your foundation as well as the community organizations that you fund. I think amplifying those voices is one of the main things that we prioritize at Liberty Hill, being both an amplifier and a funder of the work on the ground. We want to make sure that we're consistently listening in and then being able to be an echo chamber for the voice of community on the ground.
That's great, thank you. And it really highlights what Zahira was talking about in terms of the importance of the relationships and building the relationships with electeds, because that is what enables you to make that phone call when you need to do that. And I also appreciate you pitching in on filling out some of the rules and nuances on things that don't count as lobbying so that people can take advantage of them. One other tidbit I was going to offer in that regard is just that, Zahira lifted up a lot of work that is done jointly with the county, and so one of the things that you can take advantage of in that kind of a situation is an exception for jointly funded projects. So if you are jointly funding a project with a government entity, you have full abilities to discuss that project with that government entity without having any of that kind of discussion be considered lobbying. So I thought I'd just mention that. That exception, which may or may not be something that folks are familiar with. Folks can feel free to dive in with any of their favorite exceptions or areas of opportunity that they use. But I thought I would ask a different question. So this is kind of about the idea of you've both already touched on this a little bit, but the balance between, funding community-based organizations who are advocating, or you as foundation staff and other people affiliated with the foundation, board members possibly, advocating yourselves. And what is the balance that you're looking at and thinking about when you're thinking about those two aspects of advocacy? I will start this time with Jenny and then go back to Zahira, if that's okay.
Sure. I think Zahira laid it out a good balance. She used the 80%, 20% earlier. And I think that's probably about right in terms of the amount of time, both in terms of supporting our community partners with grant making and training, and then also dedicating our own staff time to bring people together around a common agenda and or advocate directly ourselves. Or in some cases for Liberty Hill, a public foundation, we're engaging our donors in that greater advocacy as well. So it's not just us, but we're doing some calls to action to encourage our donors to make those calls as well, since their voices are also powerful. And it really depends. Oftentimes, if we're in a particularly heated campaign, for example, Liberty Hill for a long time has supported the Stand LA Coalition, the Standing Together Against Neighborhood Drilling. And so we may be more involved in direct advocacy, engaged with our community partners in a particular moment to get a bill through a committee or to get something through city council. But I think overall, certainly the bulk of our time is spent on supporting our community partners and lifting up their messages versus that direct engagement ourselves.
Thank you. And I'll just build on that. And our grant making is a little bit different in terms of the perspective. So at the foundation, we fund in the areas, we fund general operating support, programmatic support, and capital support. And so I would say that in terms of our funding, we're not necessarily funding advocacy. We're not funding, Nona, earlier you were laying out the rules, we're not funding lobbying. But we do fund organizations that engage in that work. So for example, Alliance for Children's Rights. a portion of the work that they do is very much advocacy work. The work that we're funding them for is their other areas of work and the other pieces that they're moving forward. But I think that with a lot of the organizations, what we've seen over the years, and what I've definitely seen in terms of my time in philanthropy, is that a lot of organizations will engage in something that they may not call advocacy, but it's some level of systems change work. Because if they've been doing this work for decades, and if you've been, for example, working at an after-school program or at a food pantry for decades, and you have served 1, 2, 3 generations, and they keep coming back, eventually the people who work there start to think, like, what else can we do rather than serving the next generation? Is there something else we can think about from a systems perspective? And so I would say that from a systems perspective, in terms of the organizations that we work with, there are probably like a fair number of them that are doing some level of systems change work, because as they're delivering direct services, they're trying to figure out, how do we stop from having to support the next generation? They still want to deliver their work, they still want to deliver the amazing services that they're providing, but they're thinking about, there is this piece in terms of generational poverty and generational these generational concerns, and how do we start to address them? And addressing that is the old story in terms of the babies that are being thrown into the water, which is, I'm always looking for another one so that we don't have to think about babies being thrown in water, but kind of going upstream. And that's the systems perspective of how do you go upstream. And so I would say the balance of our work is, most of our work is that responsive grant making. It's that 80%. It's whatever organizations are coming to us with. And half of our grant making within that response grant making is general operating support. And then that other 20% is that work where we're working with organizations and with governmental entities, where we're really thinking about these strategic initiatives and these strategic efforts.
That's great. And I just want to list up right now that these are really best practices in terms of grant making. I briefly breezed through the slide about funding for nonprofits and community-based organizations that advocate, and general support is like number one, the best way to support organizations that do advocate and sometimes lobby, as they have the right to do. And so, it's true, as Zahira says, we're not funding them to lobby, we're not funding their lobbying work. That's right. And at the same time, you don't have to prohibit that use in your general operating grants. And it really is giving people that ability, as Zahira said, to go upstream and I really, my personal take on it is that groups that in those services also are the best positioned to know, being on the ground and also working with people who are directly impacted are really important pieces of being involved in advocacy. So you don't want to be disconnected from those services or from that lived experience in doing it. And then in terms of, Liberty Hill, the public foundation having the ability to earmark grants for either ballot measure work or other kinds of specifically lobbying work in addition to those other advocacy pieces. So we have some great examples here of both the funding side as well as kind of the using your own voice as a foundation. So I have some questions for a question for Jenny. You briefly mentioned funding C4s more, and I know there's a lot of interest in that. And so I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that. And I'm curious too, I have follow-up questions, but we'll see how it goes. So just tell us what you're doing in that space and if there are ways that others can get involved.
Sure. So Liberty Hill Foundation focuses on Los Angeles County, primarily funding community organizers and activism movement work. And for us, a couple years ago, we conducted a listening session and series of interviews to make sure that our funding was continuing to support movement needs in Los Angeles County. And what we heard loud and clear from community activists and organizers was that they wanted to use all the tools in their toolbox, both the C3 ability to lobby, as well as the C4 tools to be able to do even more, including working on ballot initiatives, as well as for them, it was important to be able to work on some candidate races as well. In terms of building power and creating systems change, electoral organizing is a key component of being able to do that, and a key tool that we heard loud and clear through our listening sessions and our interviews that was a missing element of the landscape in terms of both funding, as well as there were a series of emerging 501c4 organizations that really had to work in a cyclical fashion whenever there was money available during an election year, but then really had to close down shop during the off years because they really just didn't have funding to keep their call centers open, to keep their staff on board, and to continue to build that electoral power year to year to year. So we decided at Liberty Hill to bring back a program from the early 2000s. We had a Liberty Vote program that was designed at that time to train organizations and to fund organizations just beginning to put their toe in the water as it relates to 501c3 integrated voter engagement. Now, fast forward 20 years, there is a plethora of 501c4 organizations with the desire and capacity to do a lot more electoral organizing. And so we thought it was the best, unmet need that we could actually help to fill by relaunching Liberty Vote and focusing on 501c4 organizations. By doing so, we've been able to help organizations continue their electoral organizing post-2020, continue to maintain staff members, to continue to think about how to engage candidates in a variety of forums or surveys, to work on special elections, even thinking about, if we do end up having a recall election in 2021. So the organizations, the C4 and the C3 side are both ready and able to engage at a moment's notice and to continue to build power over time, as opposed to doing a lot of voter engagement, but then not being able to follow up with folks right after the election ending. So that's why we decided to fund it, really driven by feedback from movement leaders and activists throughout Los Angeles County. And for us, we're in it for the long term. We don't want our money to be cyclical, and we invite other funders to join us. There's a couple of funder convening or tables that exist, one called Pivot, which is statewide, that focuses on civic engagement. And I would certainly welcome a call with any of the other funders that are interested more deeply engaging around civic engagement to discuss how we might be able to partner and synergize around the topic.
Wonderful. So I just wanted on that note to kind of give the short legal summary, right? Because people are curious, like, oh, well, can they fund C4s and can they fund electoral organizing? And the answer is yes, they can fund C4s. Both public and private foundations can fund C4s. Now, obviously, 501c3s, whether they're private or public, can't fund work that supports or opposes candidates for office, but that's by no means the majority of the work that's being done by these C4s or any C4s, because that's the way they're structured under tax law. So so there's a lot of work that these groups are doing that can be funded by both public and private foundations, and that investment, I think, really helps to build the infrastructure for that power building across the board. Private foundations do have to exercise expenditure responsibility. This is the one time when private foundations actually are required to prohibit lobbying in the agreements, which still, although C4s do a lot of lobbying, still they do many other kinds of work, educational, relational, et cetera. And for public foundations, they are allowed to fund lobbying work within their own lobbying limits, as long as they're not funding the partisan candidate related work. So that's the brief overview there. So I'm really, well, I'm curious about how you see kind of networks or coordination developing, because I've noticed that there are really a growing number of C4s, and many of them are very small. And as you kind of alluded to and described the funding challenges that they have, how do you see kind of the coordination or the networks working for this network of small organizations? Jenny?
That's a great question. I think that it's still evolving, but there are plenty of opportunities to join forces and collaborate, because obviously these campaigns, it's important for whether it be an electoral campaign or continuing to build electoral power even outside of the election cycle, for that to be complementary, and for organizations across our region, let's say Los Angeles, to be able to think about coordinated strategies that don't necessarily duplicate energies or contradict one another. So for example, obviously I mentioned earlier, California Calls and Million Voter Project are great leaders in this arena, really at the forefront of integrated voter engagement. Even coining that very term was something that the Million Voter Project and California Calls networks were able to do. On the funder side, I mentioned Pivot, which is a funder and activist and organizer space where we come together and strategize together about how to build electoral power and to build a greater civic engagement. And at Liberty Hill, we're actually hosting on Thursday a convening that will continue a reflection on the 2020 elections and figure out what support may be needed to bring folks together locally here in Los Angeles to continue to think about 2022 and beyond as a collective, with many of the organizations focused potentially even in their own city, like Burbank or Pomona led their own ballot initiatives, Long Beach. Of course, there were countywide ballot initiatives, but making sure that we understand what's going on in each local municipality and that those strategies can be complementary to one another. So the successful campaign in Culver City to protect renter protections, what can we learn from that if we're going to go back to the ballot in Pomona again to expand renter protections, for example? So Liberty Hill is engaging in these types of conversations.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I really appreciate that. We need to wrap up, and there's so much more to discuss. So I look forward to continuing this conversation with you both in many ways. And thank you to Zahira and Jenny for being part of this conversation, and to makers for hosting us. So much, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.